whilst the 300 billion sounds like a lot, actually most of it is being offered in debt creating loans. So imagine, I'm an arsonist. I come and burn down your house. I turn my back and I say to you, well, you have to pick up the tab. And if you can't afford to pick up the tab, here, I'm going to lend you some money and make a profit out of it. That's what's being offered to many developing countries.
Now, on yesterday's programme, in fact, exactly this time yesterday, we were following the dramatic last-minute twists and turns from the COP29 climate talks in Baku, Azerbaijan, as it seemed the summit could actually collapse without a final agreement. However, in the early hours of this morning, negotiators finally agreed a deal on the money, a target for richer polluting countries like the UK, the EU and Japan to pay $300 billion a year by 2035 to help the less developed countries tackle climate change. I mean, they bear the majority of the brunt of it, after all. It is higher than the $100 billion that is currently required, but is a far cry from the $1.3 trillion experts say is needed. The deal has been widely criticised. The African group of negotiators described it as too little, too late, with the Nigerian delegation calling it a joke. But Western leaders welcome the deal, with the US President Joe Biden saying it puts the world one significant step closer to achieving our climate goals, while the UK's Energy Secretary Ed Miliband said it was a good deal for Britain.
I think what's important from a British point of view is that this is just an overall total for the world as a whole. You've got new countries that haven't contributed before, like China, that are going to be counted for the first time, and that's important. And it's also in our interests.
In our interest, says Ed Miliband. Well, let's talk to Asad Rehman, who is the Executive Director of War on Want. And Asad, you've been taking part in the COP negotiations for many years, actually, and you sit on the COP29 Coalition Steering Committee. You just got back from Baku. How do you feel?
Well, I feel exhausted and I feel very frustrated. You mentioned in your opening, Henry, that the Nigerian delegate called it a joke. It's a deadly joke for people and planet. The money is insufficient, inadequate, and frankly insulting. First of all,
why is it insulting, Asad?
Well, we began these climate negotiations with a dire warning from the UN that the goal to keep temperatures well below 1.5 is on life support, that we're going to bust through 2 degrees in a matter of decades. And within this lifetime of somebody, by the end of the century, we'll be at temperatures of 3 degrees warming. This is where the very question of humanity and society as we know it will be at risk. So you expect there were to be a sense of urgency and a sense of ambition. For 2 weeks of the negotiations, rich developed countries did not put a number on the table that could be negotiated, discussed. At the very, very last moment, they drop in this number, 250 billion first, and then 300 billion. That is nowhere near what is needed. The UN has estimated we need between 5 and 7 trillion. Developing countries were not even asking for that. They were asking, look, we want 600 billion in public grants, because they know that in the last pledge that was made, only just over 30 billion of it was new money. The rest of it was in debt creating loans. And
well, it's important to explain to people what this means. I mean, at the moment, there is a current requirement of $100 billion a year, and that comes from a previous COP. So we're now talking about $300 billion a year. Now, in anybody's money, that's a significant increase.
Well, first of all, I suppose it's just important to say that this is a legal obligation. The legal obligation comes from the fact that rich countries, developed countries, have caused most of the emissions in the atmosphere and are causing most of the damages. The killer floods, fires, droughts that are overwhelming many, many parts of the world make it very difficult for developing countries who are locked into poverty from being able to protect their citizens, be able to adapt, and are overwhelmed with the cost of these huge extreme weather events. And that is going to get worse and worse and worse. So developed countries are meant to put an adequate number on the table. And whilst the 300 billion sounds like a lot, actually most of it is being offered in debt creating loans. So imagine, I'm an arsonist. I come and burn down your house. I turn my back and I say to you, well, you have to pick up the tab. And if you can't afford to pick up the tab, here, I'm going to lend you some money and make a profit out of it. That's what's being offered to many developing countries.
But I suppose the difficulty with that particular analogy, Asad, is that we're all living in the same house. You know, the arsonist is not living somewhere else in some mansion. The arsonist, if you by that you mean the US, the EU, the highly developed industrialized countries, they're living in the same house, just a different wing of it. So if it burns down, we all burn down.
Absolutely. The problem is, I think there are some countries who think that that their wealth will allow them to somehow, protect themselves from the ravages that are around the corner. Look, we saw during the COVID pandemic how we're all connected, how issues can affect food supplies, for example. We're living in a world where all of our food systems are connected. So these impacts lead to price increases. They affect all of us. Absolutely. But there is a reality that's the global north has more resources and capacity to be able to deal with when extreme weather events happen. I mean, the United States, for example, has spent over about $1.7 trillion dealing with climate impacts in the United States alone. That's not money that's available to developing countries. When Pakistan had a flood, they had to go and borrow from the banks because the cost was $45 billion, the cost of one extreme weather event. So it's a very different reality. And that's what developing countries were saying. Look, you caused this problem. You have to help us address it. And
but Asad, let me put this to you.
Yes, sure.
These are wealthy countries. And of course, they're able to borrow from the financial markets and other sources of cash at far cheaper rates than the developing countries, which are considered at greater risk. But these countries, including the US, including the UK, including most European countries, they're all indebted themselves. And if a significant proportion of this money has to come from taxpayers, from public debt, then they're going to have to explain this and sell this to the people who vote them in, or, as we saw with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, vote them out.
Sure, and this is definitely not about actually raiding the public coffers. I mean, what the rich countries could do, and I mean, it's incredible that we still hand out trillions in taxpayer handouts to the very fossil fuel companies and industrial foods businesses that are destroying the planet. Over 7 trillion is handed out globally. The UK gives tax rebates of over 800 billion to the very fossil fuel giants that are causing this problem. We could tax corporations. Corporations pay less tax around the world than ordinary people do. We could tax the super wealthy. I mean, just in the last decade, the 1% who are actually responsible for the majority of emissions, they've amassed wealth of close to about 43 trillion. And that's new wealth. That's not even the existing wealth. They pay less tax than you and me or an ordinary cleaner. So these are proposals that are out there saying, look, there is money. We're spending huge amounts of money. We spend it on the military. We spend it on all of these different things. If we redirected some of those money, that would be good for people. It'd be good for the economy, and it could be, of course, good for the planet. And we all benefit. So This is definitely not stealing from Peter for Paul. And in fact, many of the things that people are calling for, we should be investing both domestically and globally to protect our citizens.
All right. Asad Rehman, Executive Director of War on Want, fresh from Baku. Disappointed indeed. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.